Hi, and welcome to our 10th video presentation for our English 2170 Introduction to Film class. This one is on defining what movie stars are. The interesting thing about movie stars is that they weren't inherent in the medium itself. We didn't have movie stars from the very beginning of cinema. Rather, for the first 15 years or so of cinema, through all the cinema of attractions period, and even halfway through the Nickelodeon period, there were no such thing as movie stars, even though there was a precedent for stars from live theater. Why? Well, for a couple reasons. One is that the studios discouraged the development of stars because they were afraid that stars would demand higher wages, and so they labored to keep the performers anonymous. Second was the idea that the performers themselves didn't want their names to get out because, remember, cinema was considered a low-class art form, and as a result, if any of these people wanted to have a career in live theater and become a star in a legitimate form, a legitimate medium, they don't want their past in motion pictures to be known. And so both performers and studios were happy to depress the idea of stardom. That is, until Carl Laemmle in 1910 was coming out of Nickelodeon in Chicago, where Laemmle's IMP studio was located, would later become Universal Studios, and said, and overheard a conversation between two women saying, "We really like that Biograph girl," referring to a film made by imp competitor Biograph Studios that was impressive, that they really liked that one particular woman, and Laemmle thought, well, I'll risk the danger of paying a performer a bigger wage, and what I will do is try to hire this Biograph girl to work for my independent motion picture company rather than for Biograph. He contacted the woman who the ladies were talking about, a woman named Florence Lawrence, believe it or not, and found out that her contract with Biograph was going to elapse in a few months. And they made up a plan, and the plan was this. When Florence Lawrence's contract with Biograph ended, she decamped to the imp and then didn't do anything for several months. And in the meantime, Carl Laemmle spread lies about her having amnesia, about her fleeing to South America, about her getting hit by a bus, etc., etc. Let these, gossipy rumors kind of bubble on the hot plate for a while. And then came out with an ad saying, "We nail a lie. The blackest lie that we've heard is that Florence Lawrence was hit by a bus, etc., etc." No, she simply signed up to be a star for the Independent Motion Picture Company. So come see The Broken Bath, the first film that she'll do for the imp, etc., etc. Basically, what Carl Laemmle did is manufacture a lie and then pretend to nail the lie in order to build up publicity about Florence Lawrence's defection from the Biograph Studios to the imp studios. This is usually seen as the moment in the creation of stardom for two reasons. One is that what Laemmle was doing is exploiting Florence Lawrence's popularity and building her up into a star, but also using publicity to do it. Because as we'll see, publicity is incredibly important. Promotion is incredibly important to the idea of building up a star. The most important thing to remember about a star is that a star is an economic engine for a studio. That is, a star uses their appeal, their sexuality, their abilities in order to sell more tickets. And that's their primary usefulness for a movie studio. But the interesting thing about a star is that it's impossible to sort of nail down a formula for what's going to make for a popular star. A popular star has a certain it quality, a kind of je ne sais quoi, that can't be pinned down, that makes them appeal to certain audiences at certain times in certain nations' histories. And one of the things that makes it so hard to pin down what's going to make for an appealing star is that a star is at least partially an off-camera biography of a person. That in addition to the attributes that they show on screen, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, they also are involved in all kinds of different discourses that leap off the screen and enter into newspapers, television shows, internet promotions, and all kinds of other different discourses. So for the way in which people who study stardom categorize these discourses are the following. First is promotion. And promotion is what the studio does in order to promote someone as a star. So a star is, can reach out to an audience and become a sudden smash, but usually stars are very carefully cultivated by their agents or by a studio in order to become popular with an audience. And this is very tightly controlled to the point where During the classical Hollywood cinema, the big studios, the vertically integrated studios, would make up fake biographies and fake names for all their stars in order to give them some sort of allure. Sometimes this had tragic consequences in the sense of, say, somebody like Rock Hudson, who was marketed as a rugged He-Man adventurer in a number of the films he made in the 50s and 60s, and who himself was gay and could never express that on screen, and only expressed it in his personal life, late in his personal life when he caught AIDS and deliberately outed himself as a gay man. He had to live in the closet because that was the history that the studio had developed for Rock Hudson. There's also publicity, and that refers to publicity about a star that happens outside the confines of the studio. Most of it positive, right? You can watch a lot of news shows, for example, where stars appear in doing charitable works, or newspaper articles about stars speaking out about social causes, et cetera, et cetera. But publicity, because it's not controlled by the studio, can backfire as well. So when you have publicity, you can have bad rumors circulating about your stars, dangerous discourses out there that threaten to erode the star's popularity. Ingrid Bergman is a good example. She had an affair with an Italian director named Roberto Rossellini and left her husband for Rossellini. And this publicity, when it happened in the 1940s, when the event with Ingrid Bergman happened in the 1940s, was so detrimental to her career that she was blackballed from working in Hollywood because she was considered to be a morally unfit person. Not that Hollywood has always been a bastion of morality, but be that as it may. She was denounced also on the Senate floor and seen as being a traitorous, adulterous woman in a time when a traitorous, adulterous woman would sacrifice her career and lose her career as a result of her actions. There's also the notion of history. That is, there's an ideology, an idea of social organization and social beliefs that the star intersects with. And sometimes that's beneficial to the star and sometimes that's not. It explains why a star can be popular one year and then be not so popular the next year. Changes in trends, changes in politics, changes in beliefs, shifts towards liberalism and conservatism means that certain stars are popular at certain times and less popular at other times. So the life cycle of a star, the endurance of a star, is not dependent on what a star does on screen, but on these forms of promotion, publicity, and in particularly the way in which ideological winds can change and audiences' tastes can change. That's not to say, however, that what a star brings to their performance on screen doesn't have an effect on audiences. Very specifically, what they bring physically in their appearances on screen can have a huge effect on audiences. Their vocal performance, for example. What does their voice sound like, and how is that appropriate for the role that they're playing? Roland Barthes, the great French film and cultural critic, has a phrase to describe this called the grain of the voice. That is the voice mellifluous? Is it beautiful? Is it funny? What kind of effect does this voice have on us? We know people who have beautiful voices, and it starts there with the delivering of dialogue, especially, of course, after the conversion to sound. Sometimes someone is notable because their vocal performance is unusual. The picture here on the slide is of Gilbert Gottfried, who has probably the most obnoxious voice in history. Look him up. He's on Cameo if you ever want to get Gilbert Gottfried to do your answering machine for your phone, your answering message. But he has a voice like this, and he plays the parrot in the original version of Aladdin. And he's made a career out of kind of going against the idea of the beautiful voice and embracing this kind of comic, screechy voice. Also, what do performers do with their faces? Are their faces symmetrical in a traditionally beautiful way? Or do they convey a kind of offbeat beauty? Or are they ugly, and for that reason they're compelling for us to look at? And what do they do with their faces? Do they make themselves more ugly, more beautiful? Do they have ways of radiating surprise? All these things can also attract. Again, you're not sure what's going to connect with an audience, but the face is the instrument of the actor. Gestural performance. What do they do with their hands? Do they move? Do they, are they self-contained and tight, or are they more loose with the way that they gesture? Are their hands particularly dancey as they perform? All these things, again, make up the performance that they give. And then finally, body, which it's almost biology is destiny, because there are certain people, let's say, for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's built huge, or John Wayne, who's built huge and built for certain roles, at least in the way in which Hollywood tends to categorize stars, versus people with smaller bodies, people with more voluptuous bodies, people who are sexier, people who are not so sexy, et cetera, et cetera. All these elements go into creating the way in which the star appears on screen, and are complemented by the discourses we already described about promotion and publicity to create the overall gestalt of the star. Even the very notion of stardom has changed over time. Up until about 1950 or so, the classical Hollywood cinema used to cultivate what was called personality stars. Remember that the studios themselves, in keeping up with the constant demand for new product that movie spectators had during the classical Hollywood cinema, would crank out movies as fast as they could, and so it behooved them to find a way to take performers and put them in this kind of fast tilt assembly line kind of system. And that's precisely what they did by cultivating what scholars call personality stars. That is, the big stars of classical Hollywood were people who specialized in playing a particular type of role. And once they played that role, they would repeat that role over the course of every movie that they would do, or as many movies as the studio could force them to do. So James Cagney, for example, excelled at playing gangsters at Warner Brothers in the 1930s, and he would play one gangster, then another and another. They'd have him play gangsters all the time because that was the perfect way in which he fit into the quick assembly line production, particularly at Warner's. He would sometimes go on sick outs, right? He would have to show up at the set of the fourth gangster movie that he's been doing, and he would call in and say, "Oh, I'm sick," just to get out of doing it and to sort of, ease up from playing the same roles over and over again that were part of his contract. Two personality stars that really fit into this kind of paradigm, even past 1950, are John Wayne, who we see here as a young man whose large body and sort of gruff physique and gruff voice made him perfect to play the sort of cowboy with a heart of gold. He was in over 100 westerns in his career. And then somebody like Marilyn Monroe, who was kind of the tail end of the personality star era and was kind of forced into it by just, again, that sort of sheer accident of biology. She was built, she was sexy, she dyed her hair blonde, and unfortunately she was constantly pigeonholed over and over again throughout her too short career into playing the blonde bimbo. And so being a personality star doesn't give the performer a lot of room to play all kinds of different roles. Although, to Monroe's credit, she was trying to do different roles near the end of her life. But I think part of the reason why she committed suicide is she felt like no one would ever take her seriously as a performer because she was fitting into this particular sort of blonde bimbo personality star niche that she'd been forced into by the studios. But personality stars are those stars which play the same role in almost every film from film to film to film. And we still have personality stars today for sure. That said, since 1950, there's been a shift away from personality stars to what scholars call actor stars. That is, stars that we esteem, that we like, that we pay money to go see their movies, not because they play the same role from film to film to film, but because they play different roles from film to film to film. Here's two of them, Daniel Day-Lewis and Meryl Streep, both of whom are acclaimed actors who are able to completely immerse themselves in the roles that they play, to completely become the characters that they become. The process of how they become these characters is something we'll talk about in the next video, but needless to say, we like Daniel Day-Lewis because in one film he can play, a terrible oil magnate, and in the next he can play a sort of fussy tailor, and in the next he can play, an Irish revolutionary, and the next he can play, et cetera, a tormented theater director, whatever. Or Meryl Streep, who is queen of accents, who can master whatever accent regardless of language to completely become a character. So she can be in a film like The Devil Wears Prada and then be a suffragette leader with a perfect British accent. So these actor stars are the ones that our generation, modern Hollywood cinema, tends to look at as being the ones that are truly talented and worthy of our support because they're able to incarnate themselves into a lot of different characters. It's kind of the opposite of the idea of the personality star. So we have these two categories, actor stars and personality stars, but the line between them can be very porous, and sometimes actor stars can be so popular that they're shoehorned into becoming personality stars, and sometimes personality stars can transcend the limitations of their repeated role and become something like an actor star. On the left here, you see a picture of Anthony Perkins, who in the late 1950s became a leading man in a number of different genres. This is a romantic comedy starring Jane Fonda, who's standing behind him, called Tall Story, about a girl in high school who falls for a high school basketball player played by Perkins. He also plays a deputy in a Western called The Tin Star in 1957. He plays a troubled and mentally ill baseball player in Fear Strikes Out in, I believe, 1956. So he plays a lot of different roles. And then in 1960, he gets his role as Norman Bates in Psycho. And according to his autobiography, Perkins writes that his career was ruined, actually, by Psycho. Of course, it made him into a star overnight, and that film itself is a classic. But it also meant that nobody would take him seriously for the plethora of other roles that he used to be able to perform. Nobody would take him seriously if he auditioned to be in a romantic comedy or in a suspense film that wasn't Psycho. And so for the rest of his career, he was kind of dogged by the shadow of Psycho, and nobody wanted to cast him in a film unless it was either a direct Psycho sequel or some sort of horror film. He felt like he had gone from being an actor star who was building a career based on diverse performances to a personality star stereotyped into being a horror star. But every once in a while, you get a personality star who tries and sometimes succeeds to become an actor star. Jim Carrey is a good example, who began his career with the Ace Ventura movies and then started to branch out in more serious films. This is a still, of course, from 2003's Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. The interesting thing about Jim Carrey, though, however, when he tried to branch out and do these different roles, the audience did not go with him. Eternal Sunshine did okay at the box office, but other films like The Truman Show or The Majestic did not perform well at the box office, and Jim Carrey career went in decline, I think, as a result of this. He was never the megastar he was when he was doing his goofy comedies. And that's a good example of how stars can go in and out of fashion. And every once in a while, there are people who are personality stars who can become actor stars. I think Jim Carrey's particular example there would have been somebody like Robin Williams, who began with funny comedies like Good Morning Vietnam, and then segued into more serious roles like the supporting actor nomination that he won for Good Will Hunting. He wanted to branch out, and he was more successful at it than Jim Carrey was. So the big question here at the end of the video is, why did our criteria for what makes a good star shift from personality stars to actor stars around 1950? And I'll take that up in the next video. Bye.